What have you learned?
So, just finished reading the Flower Ornament scripture, and I was reading the appendix at the end,
Mm-hmm.
which has like the
There's a couple of
technical
appendices
terminology.
at the end, isn't there?
There's what?
Isn't there a couple of them?
There's a couple. So I was reading the first one, which is
What
like the
page? What page?
1521,
Okay. These are good to read, by the way. I'm glad you're reading them.
and he talks about the like innumerable. I forget exactly what he said, but something like the innumerable Buddha lands. And one way of thinking about it is that everybody, if you take 10 people, each person has, a perception or an idea of every 10 person, and that perception or idea is different than the next person. So you take 10 people, but you actually have 100 different people.
And then you have them in combination, right? And then
In combination.
the permutations get, astronomical very quickly.
Yeah, and then even one person has different versions of themselves.
Correct.
You know,
Very good. Very
that's
good. Some
other more.
wise guy. I was in group therapy, and part of my psychiatric training was to be in group therapy. And some wise guy mathematician did a mathematical description of how many permutations of thought processes and combined thought processes were at play in a group of say 8 or 9 residents, and the number's astronomical. Very good, yes. But so
And
all we need focus on now is the individual. But if you think about it, there's also collective intelligence, right? Which creates another Buddha land and or Buddhaverse, and good. So you could see how they could be innumerable very quickly.
yeah,
And if we scale to the population of the planet, then it's by necessity almost uncountable.
yeah. I mean, you don't even have to you can just go to the level of the city, and it's unfathomable
So
already.
good. So you see how it's closer to reality now.
What do you mean by that?
Well,
What's
the
closer to
the
reality?
mental
That
universes,
idea?
let's call them mental universes or
Mm-hmm.
mental fields, right? For each individual person, let's give them one mental field. That's not a stretch at all for anybody, as concrete as or reductionist as you
Mm-hmm.
want to be. That's how many billion fields, mental fields, right? And a
Mm-hmm.
person's subjective experience is their subjective experience. And when they're born, it starts on this planet, and when they die, it's gone. That's the end of that universe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you, it's actually more parsimonious to look at it that way.
What does parsimonious mean?
Just look it up real quick. I think it's good for everybody.
Parsimonious, an adjective, unwilling to spend money or use resources, stingy or frugal.
It's more frugal. And in other words, do you know Occam's? Well, that's not the way I was using it. I was using it in the scientific sense that, do you know what Occam's razor is?
Is that like the simplest
Yeah,
explanation is usually the one?
right. Why don't you read that one to folks, and then we can talk about parsimony and science.
Occam's razor is a principle of theory,
Okay, you need to
construction, or
speak.
evaluation.
You need to speak up and articulate really clearly. You have a beautiful voice, but it drops off. So
Hmm.
I've noticed that over there. Okay, so go.
Occam's razor is a principle of theory, construction, or evaluation, according to which other things equal explanations that posit fewer entities or fewer kinds of entities are to be preferred to explanations that posit more.
Right. So the fewer assumptions you have to make, the more likely what you're saying is useful and true. And so parsimonious would be to be
It's
frugal.
also known as the principle of parsimony,
Okay,
or the law of.
the
There
law
you
of
go.
parsimony.
Hmm.
It verges on being a law,
Mm.
because if you have to make 10 assumptions to describe something or to think about something, then that's not nearly as good as if you only have to make one assumption. But we should note while we're here that all science so far depends on a miracle, right? At least one miracle, and you don't want it to depend on, like, the Big Bang. Where did it come from? Well, that's a big miracle, right?
Yeah.
So science always has to make some assumptions, which another word for assumptions, frankly, is miracle. So science requires miracles just the way religion does, but it may be more parsimonious in the miracles that are required or the assumptions that are required. Okay, there's a nice dry left brain intro. Good. That's a good thing to have learned, by the way. Excellent. Good thing to contemplate. Now,
And I got this book as well that I started reading.
The Case Against Reality: How Evolutionary Hid the Truth. I can't read that. Hid the Truth from Our Eyes by Donald D. Hoffman. Okay, good. I mean, he's rediscovering something that's been known since, for at least 2,500, 3,000 years, maybe longer. I mean, Pythagoras understood it. And so, good. Donald Hoffman, he's got a good brain. He's a mathematician and a philosopher, and he's hit the wall, which more and more scientists are going to hit, which is that to try and explain consciousness in terms of physical phenomenon is not going to work. We've been trying it for 300 years. It's not going to work. Or longer. I mean, also Descartes had the same problem. And so what he's decided is that consciousness is fundamental. It is fundamental in the universe, which is basically the same thing the Zenists and the Hawaiian Buddhists were saying in the 2nd century. Well, Zen wasn't around then, but the Hawaiian Buddhists, this is Hawaiian Buddhism, folks. They were saying this in the 2nd century, and there was a long history before that. Consciousness is what is fundamental in this universe. This universe is consciousness. And then we go from there, but okay, good. Good, that's a good book to read. He's also on a lot of YouTubes for people that are so inclined. It's Donald, what's his middle initial?
E.
Hoffman.
E. Hoffman.
Yeah. And it's interesting, he got there the hard way, which mathematicians and physicists and scientists do. Eventually they come to the same realization as, say, for example, the Sufis. But they go about it the long, hard way. Whereas reading sutra and studying Buddhism or Sufism or something like that is the easy way, relatively speaking. Good.
How is it easier?
Well, depending on your brain, some people don't like a lot of math and they don't like a lot of physics. They don't like to study, how particles scatter and calculus and But you don't need it.
Got it.
Also, this level of insight can be very, very powerful and very, very useful, but also very, very perilous. You end up like Nietzsche or something, a nihilist, or you end up with, nothing matters, or nothing's real, or some cockamamie, overgeneralization like that. And so an operating system like this one, like the Hawaiian Buddhist one, which is the one I'm hoping for the modern world, pretty much, that in Christianity or Islam or something, to keep people honest and straight, or Judaism, this gives otherwise atheistic people or agnostic people an operating system for life. In other words, it's not just the insight, it's also the practical aspects of conducting a good life or having a good life. One that you look back on when you're old and say, hey, well, I did what I could.
On that note, in the appendix of the Flower Ornament scripture, there's a footnote where he says the abstract philosophy of the school based on this scripture is presented elsewhere, and he points to another translation of his.
What page are you
on? 1521.
Okay. He points to another translation. Good.
Yeah, entry into the inconceivable and an introduction to Hawaiian Buddhism.
Yeah.
Is that worth reading?
Later it is. But later it makes sense, but not yet.
Okay.
I'm just trying to see if I have it here. It's basically a description of the last book. It's a description of the last book in the flower ornament scripture called Entry into the Realm of Reality. Some of these books are long enough to be standalone sutras of their own, but for developmental purposes, it's important to familiarize yourself with all of them. Very important to familiarize yourself with all of them. He goes into more detail. You know, he's a very rigorous translator. He has a summa cum laude degree from Harvard, and he studied in China and Japan and Korea. You know, he learned all these languages and the ancient dialects. And so it's a little bit more academic. And later you'll have something to read when you're an older man. But right now, it's a matter of getting the level of realization that you need to keep going.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Good.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Good that you're reading appendices. Good. If I might just editorialize a bit, Thomas Cleary has translated many books, and the books, of course, are priceless. Like, for example, here's one here. This is Dojin Shoben Genzo, right? But as valuable, what I've found over the years is that as valuable as the book may be, and some of them are very, very, very priceless, his notes or his intros are equally valuable. That's the level of realization we're dealing with Thomas Cleary. So always read his intros. Always, when you can, read his appendices. Always read his notes. They're very, very useful. Okay.
Right. They seem to sometimes just like unlock some understanding immediately after reading his notes.
Okay, you're garbling. You got to speak really crisply, please.
I was saying after reading his notes unlocks some understanding for me.
Absolutely. I think that's a universal experience, and that's definitely true for me as well.
Going back to Donald Hoffman, he brings up this argument about consciousness. He states that, like, the traditional neuroscience view is that consciousness is arising from neurons because there's a correlate of neural activity that they've measured. For example, like when operating on people, they poke their brain and they see the color red or something like that, right? And
yes.
So there's
in the 20th century, well, they don't see the color red. That's never been demonstrated. but
something like that, right?
Well, a woman, a guy named Penfield in Canada, a Canadian neurosurgeon, did some experiments in which, he was having to remove the skull and he was doing something else in there. And the brain cells don't have any pain receptors, so he would stimulate. And one woman reported hearing fragments of a symphony, and somebody else reported something kind of like that or related. And then when you look for the follow-up studies and the replications, it's very, very shallow and very, very rare. And so I haven't really, I did that a few years back. I looked to see what corroborating evidence do we have that that's the case. And it was very, very unsatisfying. But yes, in the 20th century, we believe that consciousness came from the activity of neurons.
Well, the one he talked about is stimulation, electromagnetic stimulation, so non-intrusive, and it stimulated, it made people feel like their sensory, like they were being touched on their body, depending where you put it.
Stimulation of the parietal lobe?
I think so.
By what? Transmagnetic stimulation, TMS or something?
Yeah.
I'd be very interested to see that study. Okay, so I'd be very interested to see that. That would be interesting. But again, we just have a correlation.
Right. Yeah. So the point is there's this correlation, and then that leads people to believe that, okay, consciousness is created by this brain activity.
That's been a constant error in neurobiology. I studied neurobiology with Hubel and Weissel, and we mapped the visual cortex. There's no question that there is a neural structure which corresponds to our capacity to visualize the certain things, right? You can map the cells, and you can see how frogs, for example, see movement, or how cats perceive edges and circles and straight lines, etc. So there's no question about that. Beautiful work was done in the 70s. Hubel and Weissel won the Nobel Prize for that. It was like fantastic science back then.
My understanding is that it explains the behavior, right? It explains if you see light, these neurons fire, and
yes,
this. But it doesn't explain the consciousness.
It doesn't explain the experience.
Yeah.
It doesn't explain the flavor of a peach. And we don't have any theory that comes close to that. Mm-hmm. We have nothing. We're literally high and dry. There's probably 20 different theories of consciousness. Not one of them has a mechanism by which to get to qualia, to subjective experience, subjective conscious experience, subjective awareness.
And then we get stuck because we think, well, the neuron, the idea of a neuron, the visualization of a neuron itself is an experience.
Mm-hmm. As is the brain.
Right. Yeah. And so it can't be the real thing. It seems
well,
like
even using quantum mechanics and looking at for the there that's there, when you're looking at an object, we can't find it. What we find is like maybe some wave function. And then people got confused and they talked about collapse of a wave, but what they really meant was a collapse of a probability distribution, right? And so
I was also looking into that. I was trying to read more about that because you were talking about it in another video.
Mm-hmm.
And I still don't fully understand it. I mean, I understand the experiment, but I don't understand the result.
You could do it yourself with a flashlight. I've done it.
How did you do it?
I just took a piece of cardboard, cut some slits in it, and shined a light through it, and then you could see the difference between a single slit and a double slit. You get these patterns that.
That I understand. The part I don't understand is the observation part.
Well, the photon measurement, the measurements of the photons.
Yeah.
Well, it appears that these one photon can take one of two paths, and if it's being observed, this is the way the theory goes. If it's measured, then it only takes one path, but if it's not measured, it takes a path in which the two particles interfere with each other.
Mm.
I mean, I'm not an expert on it, but let's see.
Yeah, so I understand the idea of that.
Okay.
I just don't understand what it means to measure it. Like,
so what they did was they mapped the probability of the particle ending in one place or another, and some places had a higher probability than others, and so that function of probability got translated into the wave, wave idea, the idea of a wave, and the idea that a wave collapses when it's observed, which isn't going to work, right? It's just not going to work, I don't think, because the world is entangled, right? So let me give you an example. Well, the way they make it simpler for folks, and it's easier to explain, you're familiar with Schrodinger's cat, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a cat in a box, and the cat is in a box with an apparatus which releases a poisonous gas if a certain radioactive material decays in the poison apparatus, right? It kills the cat instantly. If it doesn't decay, the cat is alive, right? Now, so you put the cat in the box with this radioactive poison emitter, you close the box, and the question is the cat alive or dead? Well, I think from a theoretical point of view, you have to say it's both alive and dead because of the nature of the radioactive isotope emitting a photon or not. But you only find out when you open the box, and when you open the box, the cat is either alive or dead. It can't be one or the other. And so, forgive my crude description of this, but you find out whether or not that radioactive isotope has decayed or not decayed. And the only way to know that before you open the box, it's both alive and dead at the same time. Or something to do with the decay.
How is that different than like taking quantum physics out of it? If you put a cat in a box, you don't know if it's dead or alive until you open the box.
Okay.
Right?
Well, but the thing is is there a poison in the box or not a poison in the box?
There's no poison. It's just a regular cat. And
well, then if you open the box, the cat is alive. Why would the cat be dead?
Maybe it's an old cat. Maybe
no. Okay, you could do that, but now you're adding an assumption, right? You're adding more assumptions. I mean, this has something you have to work through yourself, and it's not easy, okay? And I'm probably butchering it right now. I'm sure I'm butchering it, but it's along these lines. And the idea until recently was that the observer becomes entangled with the experiment. And once the observer is entangled with the experiment, but let's go back to the cat experiment. I'll tell you what the problem with it is.
Yeah.
So the experiment, okay, the grad student brings his cat to the lab where the professor is going to demonstrate Schrodinger's thought experiment, right? This is just a thought experiment. And he puts the cat in the box with the radioactive isotope poison emitter. And there's two outcomes, possible outcomes. Either the cat is dead or the cat is alive, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that they open the box and the cat is dead. Mm-hmm. Now, when the research assistant goes back to his wife, whose cat he borrowed for this experiment, she gets mad and divorces him. And she hits him over the head with a frying pan. And now he's unmarried and he takes to drink. And he's living on Skid Row. This is a completely different universe than the universe in which the cat was alive. So the experimenter and the grad student and the wife were all entangled with the cat, you see? You know who's really good with this is David Deutsch. Beginnings of Infinity. So what entangled means is that you're in the same universe. But if you're talking about particles and you're talking about one thing, it's one thing, right? It doesn't matter how far apart they are; they're completely entangled. You can't flip one without the other, right? Mm-hmm. But the ramifications just for contemporary science are huge, obviously. And in 20th century, they couldn't grok any of this. It just didn't make sense. Einstein didn't like it a bit. Spooky action at a distance. Mm-hmm. Because it appeared to violate the maximum speed of light. All right, but the point is it's not just the observer affecting the particle; it's the particle affecting the observer and the grad student and the cat and the box and the wife, and it changes. And the guy ends up on Skid Row. So it affects Skid Row too. Do you see what I'm saying? It's a whole universe, and this is why David Deutsch ended up with multiverses. Now, we don't have. It's not satisfying, and it's even. But neither is collapse of a wave function. That doesn't really compute either. But this is something everybody must do on their own. Watch some YouTubes, read some books. David Deutsch on this is superb. I think Hoffman's not bad. There's other people as well who say that we've got real problems here in quantum mechanics. My favorite is Chris Fields, brilliant guy. But he doesn't have a lot of academic credentials, and I think people don't like the way he looks or something. I don't know, but he's really great. And just think about it. Just think it through. You can't have a particle that's entangled with an observer in a laboratory without it also being entangled with the observer's wife and her family, and so on and so forth. It's the whole universe. And this is what's meant by saying that everything in the universe, and so the Buddhists understand this, and they talked about interdependent origination, or they talked about the net of Indra, where you have this lattice, like a spider web, and in every juncture there's a diamond with infinite facets on it. Every diamond in that universe reflects every other diamond. It must, right? And so it is. We're all entangled here in this universe. And that's why when you do a quantum computer, you have to spend millions and millions of dollars trying to isolate something from the rest of the universe, and it hardly works. It works a little bit, I guess. I don't know. I'm not an expert in it, but the point is that we're all entangled. We're all interdependent. There's nothing in this universe that exists inherently alone. Everything is made up of other things. Everything is temporary, and everything has no independent inherent existence. Nothing. And so this is interdependent origination. This is one of the facets of emptiness, right, that the Buddhists consider foundational for Buddhist understanding. You have to understand that there's nothing in this world. Oh, this beautiful bird just flew by and agreed with me. There's nothing in this world disconnected from everything else in this world or this universe. And then you get into, really non-science guys like, who else is good as, Lucille? What's his first name?
Who?
A guy named Lucille. He was a teacher of Rupert Spira. Francis Lucille. He's good on this. I think he's a physicist. There's someone else good is this guy from CERN who's also a philosopher. What's his name? He's a hardcore idealist. Came by a completely different route. Had nothing to do with Buddhism.
What was that?
A philosopher whose name I'm blocking on. Starts with a B. He worked at CERN as a physicist. Then he got into math or something and philosophy. And so he's both a physicist and a philosopher, and he's a strict idealist. He's from Belgium, I think. Just search for strict idealism or strict idealism philosopher.
Strict idealism.
Bertram? No, it's not Bertrand. What's his name? He's written a bunch of books, too. He's written 20 books.
Bernardo Castro?
Bernardo Castro. Bernardo, B-E-R-N-A-D-O, Castro, K-A-S-T-R-U-P. Bernardo Castro, Francis Lucille, Rupert Spira, if you want, but he's not science or math. Let's see, who else? Donald Hoffman, David Deutsch, although David Deutsch doesn't like any of this stuff because it freaks him out, I guess. I don't know. But see, basically, we lived for 300 years with the physical as the basis of this universe. The world was made up of these little atoms which were made up of subatomic particles. And then when we get to subatomic particles, they start acting squirrely. And then we get quantum mechanics, and now everything's squirrely, right? So then, at the same time, we've got the same problem of consciousness. Where does this consciousness emerge from? Where does this qualia come from? Because we can't get from physical things, from a physical body, to the experience of love or the experience of the taste of an orange. We just can't get there. There's no. It's one is mind, one's matter, and that's why we've classically divided the two. But then, finally, we've overcome our bigotry somewhat, and we look to the ancients, and they say, well, yeah, of course not, because the basis of this world is consciousness itself. And everything's built on that consciousness. Now, how it's implemented, that's a very interesting question and a lot of fun, and that gives us scientists and computationalists and everybody else a lot to do for the foreseeable future. Oh, yeah, I left off Chris Fields. There's another great one. But so now, it still doesn't tell us the details of how this beautiful world is implemented. So we could describe that in any terms we want. We'll always end up in the same place, which is, not with location and not with space and not with time. But in the meanwhile, we could describe these mechanisms to our heart content and keep everybody happy. I mean, the scientists and the philosophers and the theoreticians. But we're going to end up in the same spot, is what I'm saying. Okay, follow-up questions. I hope did that make sense? I hope it made sense. How we had to move from a physicalism, an atom or a subatomic particle is the foundational substrate of the universe, to consciousness is the foundational substrate of the universe. And it's once you've moved there, then it's so obvious. You can't. But on the other hand, you usually need to wake up, right? People usually need to wake up. And so I think in the case of Kastrup, Bernardo Kastrup, the guy from CERN, or Donald Hoffman, they had to do a little bit of they had to do some meditation, right? Some contemplation, some serious, and they had to think independently and get rid of all the assumptions. The only assumption I'm making is that experience exists. That's the only assumption, and that one we can agree on, no?
Yeah.
Experience exists. The other folks have to invent a big bang. They have to invent some magic materials that do this and that and act this way with quantum, and they have to invent time and space working, but it's got to be relative and it's all got to disappear into a black hole and this and that. And that's all fun and fine and good, but in this century, we'll probably be preoccupied with the information theory, building on Shannon and all those guys, using qubits and computation as the descriptor of what's underneath. But it will end up in the same place. I mean, I've got thousands of years of people agreeing with my position, that position, and we only have 300 years of this physicalist dead end.
Would it be? Can I say that what we got from physics is the knowledge about information, about measurement of how we can measure things and infer information about the world.
Physics is fantastic. We got engineering from physics.
Right.
Engineering, yeah, we got engineering.
So the engineering has to do with measurement and predicting
of relative things.
Right? But it says nothing about I guess it's failing to describe the origins of the world and
of anything. And they'd ask for a miracle just as big as spontaneous generation, or as big as it's the same thing as creationism. There was nothing, and then there was the Big Bang, or there was just before the Big Bang. I mean, those are the kind of miracles that we want to do without. We don't need miracles like that in this understanding of consciousness as the basis. Here, we don't have to make any assumptions. Will you agree that consciousness or experience exists?
Yes.
Okay, so no assumptions. Now let's build the science. And now I spent a
But then
lifetime as a neuroscientist. I mean, so I came by this honestly too. I mean, I was a neurobiologist on the lab, on the bench, and then I did psychiatry and the whole 9 yards and all of that stuff, psychoanalysis, all that stuff. So, I mean, I reached this conclusion after a lifetime of work.
But is starting from that point of consciousness exists, is that going to be useful for engineering, say?
Not particularly for engineering yet. No, it's not. This is not an engineering problem, not at least in this century. It's a scientific question. It's an ontological question. It's a philosophical question. But most important, as far as I'm concerned, remember, I'm a physician. I want to help, and I don't want to harm. And so what it's useful for is helping people live their lives well without undue fear or suffering. That's what the Buddha said, right?
Right.
And Jesus said all this stuff too. He just said it in code, like, my kingdom is not of this world. Or the kingdom of heaven is within you. Or, he said it in 1,000 different ways, but he spoke in such a way that everybody could get what they needed. But he was a mystical teacher of the highest order, right? A consummate Sufi, right?
Right.
So there's nothing new here. It's just setting aside some of our 20th century arrogance, which has got us into all kinds of trouble. The other thing is, if enough modern people were to adopt this understanding or to see the obvious, then we'd be a lot less likely to kill each other, poison each other, hate each other, and take advantage of each other, right?
How come?
Because we're all one thing. We're all one consciousness. The separateness is an illusion. As Jesus said, what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. He was not speaking allegorically. He was speaking literally. So as hard as it is to grok this, there is no separateness to you or to me. We overlay the individual self on top of subjective awareness and conscious experience, and we learn how to be separate entities, but it's not the actual case. We are, in fact, a universal consciousness. That's why I have to be optimistic about everything, ultimately. Is that making sense? I hope so.
Sort of, but if you understand that, does it wipe away all your habits
no, you're still a human being, right? I mean, in other words, you're still a primate. In other words, you still need to eat and to sleep and to not be too cold or too hot, and you still have all these habits of tribalism or dominance hierarchies or lack thereof or selfishness and all this other stuff. That's why this operating system is great, because it mitigates that stuff, and it shows you how if you indulge in those kinds of selfish things, all you do is hurt yourself. Maybe not in the short term, you don't see it, but in the long term, you certainly do. And the happiest woman and the happiest man is the one without a self at all. And that sounds like Pollyanna. I'm sorry that it does, but it's true.
Sounds like what?
Pollyanna, like that person is a selfless person. But that selfless person is also the happiest person.
I don't know what Pollyanna is.
Oh, okay. Pollyanna is a shortcut for kind of childish and kind of sickly sweet sentimentality. And she's a very good girl. She's a good girl, and she's known for being a Pollyanna. A goody two-shoes.
I see.
I'm not trying to be goody two-shoes here. I'm trying to be pragmatic, hard-nosed. Now, speaking as a psychiatrist, the healthiest individuals are the ones who have transcended their self and their own selfish needs, which ain't easy because we're primates, we're apes, right? But it can be done, and that's what the Buddha meant when he said, there's a path beyond suffering, and this is it. It's a very coherent universe of thought, and it's not just Buddhist, it's also Sufi and Christian and many other religions which allow for mystical traditions. So in the 20th century, we believed that strengthening the ego was the name of the game. And it is the name of the game if you've got somebody who's psychotic or somebody who's, got a severe characters and they're fragmented or whatever. But for the vast majority of people, it's not the ego we want to strengthen. We want to transcend the ego. Because fame and gain and all those things, they may be fun for a while, but sooner or later they go south.
Mm.
And so wisdom states that a young woman or man should make preparations to live a good life. There's certain things you do and certain things you refrain from. But not because you're a goody two-shoes, because you're smart. Right? Okay.
Right.
You really got me going this today. Okay, let's go. Questions. Yeah, think of the end before you begin. That's the old Sufi adage. Think of the end before you begin. And the young people are starting out their lives, right? And the circumstances are not pretty. But that doesn't mean they're helpless. On the contrary, there's a lot that they can do. And now with all the information sources we had, it's much easier than it used to be in that sense.
What do you say more about that? Because one thing I've noticed is like there's all this like suffering is just like very apparent, and there's just like lies and madness all over the media, and it feels very helpless. So what do you mean when we're not helpless and there's a lot of things we can do?
Okay. Politics among humans, large human communities, is always nasty stuff, right? Now, what's happened is that now, because of social media and because memes are funny and because there's good music and art in there too, all this stuff is right in your face unless you filter it out, and it's toxic. In addition to that, there's government psychological warfare being waged on the population, like in America we used to do on other countries. Now we're doing it to ourselves, and there's no real coherence to it. It's just chaos out there. So you're right; it is a very malignant environment for a young mind to get lost in. So that's true, and you have to guard your mind and be very careful with it and think about what you want to do with your life. I mean, you want to be happy. Certainly you don't want to suffer. So just start there, right? And see, well, what's my plan, right? Now, I don't want to sound too much like an old man, but when I was your age, if I wanted a book, I'd have to get in a car, drive to a library. It probably wasn't there, right? It's already been checked out. Or drive to a bookstore, and the chances of it being there are quite slim because these are, not common books. So then I'd have to order it by mail. There was no Amazon, right? There was barely Xerox machines. But now, any book you can have in, 5 days? And translated too. There were no translations. So in the old days, which wasn't that long ago, you'd have a Tibetan teacher, but he didn't speak English. And so you'd have to do the best you could with what you had, and we've had very little. Now that we're drowning in information, but people can't tell the difference between the garbage and the gold. And that's the Sufi specialty, right? Is first teaching people that everything that glitters is not gold, and everything that looks attractive to read or to watch or whatever may or may not be may be not only worthless, it could be harmful. And so that's why the need for old people like me to say, hey, look, I went through a lifetime, and these are the things that really, really made a difference. These are the things that could work, and these are the things that were a complete waste of time, even though they looked good on the outside. Right? And so people learn this by going through enough self-help, right? They realize the limits of self-help. And going through enough ego bolstering, they realize the limits of bolstering the ego. And then going through enough suffering, they realize what suffering can teach and how it guides us, right? And then they learn to recognize something as toxic as contemporary politics in the social media or even on the mass media. It's all poisoned. It's warfare, right? We're at war. And they learn to turn, like Jesus himself turned his back on the world and said, called it an old hag and said, why would anybody want to have anything to do with that old hag? Referring to the world. And that's back in Roman times. And if you study some history, which is very good to do, you'll find that these kinds of things have always been going on, but they weren't as much in our face. So that's the downside to our tech. But there's many upsides as well.
Right.
All right. YouTube is one of them, if used well. Yeah, it's amazing. You have people like Michael Levine, these great cutting-edge scientists getting up there and just chatting with folks. We never had anything like that. It's fantastic. Okay, question.
Well, I mean, so there you touched on helping yourself, but what about helping others when in this environment?
It turns out that helping others is helping yourself, as Jesus and Buddha and every wise person has taught. Helping the other is yourself. You just don't know that yet. You can't help someone else without helping yourself. You can't, until you understand it, you don't understand that, but it's true. It's absolutely true. And wise people and old people understand that, right? Hopefully, otherwise they've got a bitter old age. You see what I'm saying? So, like Jesus said it best. What you do unto the least of these, or no, he said, treat your neighbor as yourself. He didn't say treat your neighbor like somebody who lives next door, and you better be nice to him because he'll be nice to you. He didn't say that. He didn't say treat him well because maybe you'll get some reciprocal good blowback, good feedback. He said treat your neighbor as yourself. Your neighbor is yourself. That's why an evolution of consciousness on this planet would be very, very helpful right now. Very, very handy. Because we would be much less likely to try and destroy each other the way we're doing. And we have done for many thousands of years. And plus the AIs would be much better too. I mean, we're programming these AIs with this mentality that's really messed up.
What do you mean by that?
The mentality is basically that of a collective ape. It's a tribal ape. The AIs are a reflection of us. The large language models, all they do is they take our written words, right, for the most part, and then they synthesize them and feed them back.
Yeah.
Well, if you take our history and our written words, it's rife with tribal ape stuff.
But they can also be tuned to be more beneficial or be more one way or another.
But to do that, we need humans who are working with these machines, these AIs, to be more evolved themselves. And I think there's a desire to do that in among some of the folks in Silicon Valley. I know that. I lived there for quite a while. But they don't go far enough usually.
How so? What are their limitations in your view?
They're okay, we could start right here. One is that the base operating principle is we gotta make money, right? And profit is a god, and understandable how they got that way because they needed to build the what do you call them, the compute centers, right?
Yes.
They needed to keep going.
Although
But the way that translates down to the consumer is like, let's get as much as we can out of the consumer, as much as he'll take. It's kind of the root things of capitalism. Whatever the market will bear, let's take from the consumer. Well, that might have been fair when you didn't have the advantage of zero cost for scaling. The margins are monstrous, right? Unlike anything we've ever seen in humanity for any length of time. Now, I'm not arguing
Right.
against capitalism because communism is far, 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 far worse.
I like it.
So one is the operating principle of profit first. A second one is because of the nature of the way things are structured, there's competition, not collaboration. And the reason there's that is because there's not a more coherent comprehension, understanding of our true circumstance here as humans.
Hmm.
Okay, so
So
ask the question again, and let's drill down because it's a good question.
yeah,
There
so
needs
I
to
was
be more
asking what.
consciousness, a higher level of consciousness.
Hmm. So I was asking what the limitations of the AI development was
The
in your
limitations
view.
of the people that are creating it.
Right. And I mean to give a counterpoint, I think a lot of the AIs are definitely capitalism driven, like the recommendation algorithms for TikTok, for example. Take They're just toxic. But the LLMs, I think most companies are losing money on LLMs at the moment,
At the
and they're
moment,
not. Yeah.
but they're hell
But
bent as quickly as possible to get to AGI first. It's just basically a
yeah.
race. Who's going to get there
But
first?
then you said there's no collaboration, and actually there is a lot of collaboration in the open source
No, you're right. You're
AIs.
right.
So
I meant
that's
conscious
the.
collaboration by more conscious people who said, "Hey, we can't leave these kids behind." I mean, I know we're in a race right now to get to the first AGI or ASI, artificial superintelligence, but meanwhile, we've got kids who have never don't know the difference between a nourishing video and one that's garbage. And we have kids that don't know anything. Kids who can't think. What are we going to do
Mhm.
about that? Apparently, these short videos in this algorithmically, addicting format and content has rendered an entire generation with no attention span, or at least that's what they
Mhm.
say, right? So wait a minute, we're
Mhm.
responsible for that. What are we going to do? And so if we understood that the consciousness of the human is a consciousness of the human, it's an entire thing. If we're going to evolve beyond ape, which we damn well better do pretty quickly, we need to think more collectively and more in terms of our health, physical and mental and spiritual, if I may use that word. Or we're just going to do what we've always done, 60 million starved here, 30 million massacred here, genocide here, pollution of an entire, continent. Or I don't want to indulge in hyperbole, but I do think
Mhm.
that the stakes at the moment, because of the machines, are very high. But there's no
Mhm.
reason to panic. It's a reason to evolve.
Right.
Okay, man, you got me on my soapbox. I'm not a preacher. I'm not a preacher. I'm really not. You asked me though, so it's your fault. Okay. Question.
So with AGI, AGI seems to be on the horizon, at least right now, for virtual knowledge work, right? So any job which is the interface for it is like a Slack, right? When you
Is like a
these office
Slack?
workers,
You mean a Slack program?
Slack is a program that companies use to communicate with each other in
Right.
real time, right? Um, and so software developers, right? It's all done virtually through messages, with very little like video-based meeting, but even that will be able to be done by the AI soon enough, right?
Right.
Um,
It'll be AI to AI.
so
No human
yeah,
involved.
all these knowledge jobs it seems that the point where an AI could do them is very near.
Very true.
Um,
That's a whole other dimension I didn't mention. Yeah. People need meaning.
yeah, and
And they used to get it from work.
One day,
But it's
I
hard
don't know where I saw
I
this.
saw a great meme. There was a Venn diagram, and on this side was the apocalypse, and on this side was work. And this, he says, how did I end up here? The guy's in the little overlap between apocalypse and still having to work. I know that was clever. Yeah, so yeah, people are not obtaining meaning from work. A lot of people are not obtaining meaning from work. Now, some people are,
Yeah, and
but a
I
lot
saw
of people are
something that was
not.
like in the industrial age, people worked with their hands, and now
And
in the information age,
built cathedrals,
and in the information age, people worked with their minds
and built TikTok.
and built TikTok.
No, or they built
And the
aqueducts, or they built, museums, or they painted or create, But I don't want to over idealize it. A lot of slaves were involved, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of military and all this stuff. So it's not let's not romanticize our past, but keep going. Sorry.
So now in the age of AI, what are we going to work with? Is there something about our humanness that we can
Yes.
use,
Yes.
right?
What is the one thing we have that the machine can never have?
Human experience.
Subjective awareness, conscious experience.
Hmm.
Now, when we mix biology with the machine, then we've created new creatures, and that's a whole other world. Now, do we
I
want to
saw a
do
video.
that? Go ahead.
I saw, I saw a video of an oyster mushroom mycelium hooked up to legs.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, you can. Back in the 70s, we were growing brain cells in tissue culture routinely. It's not a big deal. And those things will be hooked
right.
up eventually. So that's the other thing. Perhaps we want to slow down, or perhaps we want to think twice before hybridizing these machines with biology, especially our own.
Right. But back to on working like with our using our human experience, conscious experience to work. What does that look like?
What does what look like?
Well, like, working with our hands looks like, building things, cathedrals, whatever you want. Working with our minds involves, you know, information processing, working using our
Well,
conscious
I
experience
mean,
to work with.
the things that will continue are art, poetry, literature, those things that only the humans can do, right?
Hmm.
I mean, unless it's crappy art and crappy poetry and crap, I mean, the machine can do crappy stuff all the time, right? But
Right.
but when you know what your true nature is, when you realize that you are this cosmos, the whole thing, you have a lot more. This is where the Taoists come in. So with higher consciousness, you're much more likely to appreciate something like this, the Tao Te Ching. This is a translation, by the way, from the original Chinese with beautiful notes. It's not very popular on Amazon, I noticed, which makes me very, very sad. But this is Thomas Clary's translation, one of his translations of the Tao Te Ching. So when you're more conscious, you're much less likely to trash your environment, and you're much more likely to be interested in nature and things of the heart and the spirit. And so there'll be plenty of that. There'll always be other people there, or other creatures in nature itself. And so to cultivate this instead of like to use it as raw material to make your factories out of, to make, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't, use rubber trees to make rubber back in the days, right? I mean, there's a balance.
Hmm.
And this balance and harmony with nature. Now, there's a goal for humanity. How can we live collectively with less of a population, but with this incredibly advanced tech, where we're more equal-handed in how we treat each other, and we understand that the self is other, and that we must take care of everything and everyone, and in balance and harmony with the nature from which we emerge. Now we can explore the universe and have something, to bring, right? Right now we're just bringing our problems. we're just going to spread our problems someplace else. But it is conceivable. And for each individual, and for small groups of individuals, people, you can achieve peace. Now that is a universe of peace. So that's why this operating system, believe it or not, is the most rational, because you choose which universe you live in. I mean, that's completely not only in your power, it's your responsibility. And there'll always be noise on the borderlands, with the politicians and the generals and the this and the that and the, just like there's always violence in nature. No one's trying to minimize that, but you don't have to focus on it. And you and the people around you don't have to do that. And that's what communities have done historically. And that works pretty well for a while, and then it has to evolve like everything else in nature. And these are just partial. I'm just trying to, I'm trying to give the most summary kind of like things, but every situation is different and everybody's different. And so I don't want to overgeneralize, but that's one of the solutions, is smaller communities that are focused on the human heart and nature and God and the spirit and truth and peace and a life of well-being. But right now, people don't even have the wherewithal to think that way, that it's even possible.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things. I mean, it's an endless topic, obviously. But we haven't made that much progress in the last, say, 2,000 years in terms of our understanding of ourselves. And I say that as a man who spent his lifetime studying the best theories of mind and neurobiology and this and that. We don't understand ourselves as well as many of the ancients did, as a generality, without romanticizing that either. All right, a question before we stop?
I don't have any short questions.
Okay. Life is hard for animals on this planet to a point. And we are animals on this planet. Incredible. It's really extraordinary. And actually, in a strange kind of way, you wouldn't want it any other way. It's just like perfect. But remember, we're just here temporarily. We pass through.
Right.
Okay, sir?
Okay, thank you.
Guard your mind. It's not easy these days. And good, I'm glad you're reading Dependencies. That's a very good sign. Excellent. Ciao.
Okay.